Hello, my name is Ann Linehan and welcome to Talk About. Tonight our subject is going to be grandparent in divided families or grandparents disputes, a topic that will touch you in different ways. Do you have a right to see your grandchildren if your son and daughter get divorced? Suppose your son has abused in some way the children or your daughter has. Will that affect you? Can you automatically have the right to visit your grandchildren? That's going to be our subject tonight, and my guest is Pat Fernandez. I was given a little book called Love is a Grandmother, and I'd like to open it with just a poem that says a lot about grandmothers. Grandmas sometimes race you to the next lamp post, but then they sit on a wall and go a funny color. Grandchildren explore your face as if it were a treasure map, greeting every discovery with enthusiasm. Moles, wrinkles, gold-filled teeth, nice to know it's all been worthwhile to someone. The most maddening thing about grands is that they don't use the presents you get them. They even keep the ribbon. Grandmas don't just say that's nice. They reel back their eyes and roll them around, throw their hands up and smile. You get your money's worth with grandmothers. And you do get your money's worth, but many children today, and there are organizations, as you must know, where grandparents are acting as parents. We're going to talk some about that. Why are so many grandparents all of a sudden in their 60s and some even in 70s acting as grandparents? They actually cannot be the parent. They can't replace the parent, but someone needs to take care of the child. So many things have been changed. Tonight now, before I get into that though, I do want to do my regular tip of the hat, and my tip of the hat will be to the Kiwanis Pediatric Trauma Institute, and I'd like to tip it for them and to tell you a little bit about this wonderful organization. The Wilmington Kiwanis has supported the Pediatric Trauma Institute for many years. They're one of the primary contributors. They are offering a workshop with the Woburn Kiwanis on pediatric trauma. There is difference when children get hurt, and this is a worthwhile organization, a worthwhile project. You'll be hearing more about that on WCTV. The other thing that I would like to tell you about, because we do talk about things that go on in Wilmington, we've had a change with the Merrimack Valley Advertiser. You look for that. The Wilmington paper has grown. It will be a regular newspaper with full-colored pictures in it. There's another issue that I would like to bring up to you. You remember on my show a couple of months ago, the first one as a matter of fact, I mentioned that there was a rabies alert in Massachusetts. We here at WCTV have produced a public service announcement on that in cooperation with the Division of Fish and Wildlife. And at our break, we hope that you'll watch it. I now want to turn and introduce you to my guest, Pat Fernandez. And Pat, you're going to have to tell me the firm you're with because I forget it every time.
Brown, Rudnick, Fried & Gesmer in Boston.
And that's a family law.
Well, I practice family law there. It's a full-service, large Boston law firm.
And how did you, Pat, how did you get involved in grandparents' rights? Could you tell me just a little bit about that? Pat, first of all, has written several articles. You wrote one for the Yale Law Review, and you've also written an article, this book that we showed earlier. Pat was asked by the American Bar Association to write an article in this book from, was it the child's point of view?
That's right. My article in that book is called Representing Children, how to handle representing children in grandparent-parent disputes.
Representing children, that sounds a little bit like what Hillary Clinton's been talking about. Now, it's not that I am a civil rights activist and I'm a rights activist, but Pat, I'm going to be very honest with you. We were talking earlier before we went on, and you're talking about representing a 5-year-old that Grandma might not have bought him a teddy bear last Christmas, and she says, I hate Grandma, and then all of a sudden, mother and father are divorced, and the mother doesn't particularly like the mother-in-law, and you represent that child. Now, talk to me about how you're going to represent that child.
Well, first of all, when attorneys are appointed to represent children, it's not because children walk into their office. Attorneys may end up representing children because a court appoints them. That's pretty much the only way that attorneys represent children. Sometimes attorneys act as attorneys. Sometimes attorneys can act as guardians ad litem, which is kind of a different role. Also, mental health professionals often act as guardians ad litem.
Guardian ad litem, you brought up a very good subject and an interesting subject. Could you explain guardian ad litem? Because the courts appoint these, and as many people know, I have been very active in this field, and you do too in the grandparents litigation. You brought tonight, as a matter of fact, a copy of the legislation that I helped to shepherd through the Massachusetts state legislation, and it regards visitation rights to certain grandparents of unmarried minor children. Now, would you talk a little bit about that new legislation and how it was amended, and how does it affect the grandparents that has no legal right, or do they have a legal right now? People say, well, I want to visit my grandchildren.
Well, the former statute, which I believe was enacted in the early 1970s or the mid-1970s, allowed a grandparent to seek visitation with his or her grandchild only if one of the parents had died or if the parents of the child had divorced. The amendment broadened the categories of grandparents who have the right to petition the court to see their grandchildren. The statute does not give grandparents of any type the right to see their grandchildren. It only gives them the right to petition the court and have a court make a determination about whether or not visitation is in the child's best interest. So the categories of grandparents that can now sue include grandparents of certain children born out of wedlock. In order for a grandparent of a child born out of wedlock to have the right to sue, the parents cannot be living together, and the father must have acknowledged paternity, or a court must have entered a paternity judgment. If parents aren't divorced but are merely separated, whether judicially separated by having a
Now, Pat, you're beginning to sound like an attorney.
Well,
and you are an attorney, and you're one of the best in Boston, and I'm very proud to have made your acquaintance. And we've known each other now for almost a year and a half or something like that, and have worked with Professor Mark Perlin, who is a senior family law professor down at Suffolk Law School. Dr. Cass is, I've had the opportunity to meet him at Boston University working on ethics, but you and I have something else we do agree with too, even though you are an attorney, that you should first try mediation. And I have, since I've got to know you, become a member of the Massachusetts Family Mediation Association. And if you can mediate, now you make your money as a lawyer, but what would you say to people, Pat, about when you get into custody and you get into visitation?
well,
About how painful, we've talked about this, how painful and expensive it can be.
particularly in the grandparent visitation aspect, I think it's often very helpful to try to mediate the disputes before or in conjunction with seeking relief from a court. And the reason is because oftentimes the real issue between the grandparent and the parent is something that started out as a minor problem and somehow escalated into a huge catastrophe, and it shouldn't have, or it can be dealt with in ways that are probably more helpful in the long term than going to court. Going to court is expensive, it's emotionally very draining, and sometimes it doesn't resolve the underlying issues. I mean, if the parent's issue with the grandparent is that the grandparent is spoiling the child, or the grandparent is feeding the child too much candy, or that the grandparent is taking the child to a church that the parent doesn't approve of.
Now you've hit one. We don't, I mean, why is she all of a sudden doing this? I had acted as an intermediary and for a lady whose grandchildren, the mother had converted to being a Jehovah's Witness, and she had sent a birthday card. This is the type of thing that can happen. And she didn't know that Jehovah's Witnesses didn't celebrate birthdays. And so all of a sudden there was a big argument and a fight, and this lady didn't get to see her grandchildren for a long time because of just sending a birthday card.
That's exactly the kind of situation where talking about the problem, making the grandmother aware of what the mother's religion does and does not believe in, could probably resolve the issue without a costly court fight. And mediators are often better at improving communications between the parties than lawyers are. So,
Well, a lot of attorneys have joined the Mediation Association, and they're trying to, the adversarial thing in grandparents, and I have to speak from very personal experience. That's how I got involved in this. I had a very loving and nurturing experience with a grandchild, and then there was a separation and other things that happened, and the old mother-in-law syndrome, or I don't want to have anything to do with his family. And in this journey that I've been on now for 2 years, I've talked to people all over the United States. This happens so much to paternal grandparents. There's really no way to alleviate this type of thing, is there? Or how can you reestablish and not be a threat? One of the things that I do say to people when I talk to them, and of course it's easier said than done, is not to be too aggressive. I had to learn a lot of lessons in that, and I see a lot of grandparents that say, but all of a sudden it's heartbreaking. You don't see your grandchildren, and all of this is going on, and you really had nothing to do with it.
I think it's the most important thing for grandparents to realize is that it's important that you stay out of the divorce. It's not your issue. Just because your son or daughter doesn't get along with his or her spouse, that doesn't mean you should become involved. You should stay out of the picture, and if you've always had a fairly decent relationship with your daughter-in-law or your son-in-law, you should try to maintain that. You should at least be civil. You shouldn't tell your grandchildren bad things about the other parent.
And there are grandparents that do that, and they have to learn that they're walking on eggshells, and particularly in this society. But you brought up a very good point. If we're going to build relationships, we have to begin at the time that we become grandparents and realize that these are not our children. And that's hard to do sometimes for a grandparent. And of course, my generation, Grandma's word was law. And then maybe my mother would take me out after I'd leave Grandma's, and she'd say, now you do what your grandma says to do when you're at her house. You do what I say to do when I'm at home. That rule doesn't apply anymore, does it?
Well, I think if you're a grandparent and you know that the child's parents have very strong feelings about something, that you're really overstepping your bounds if you do something that they have told you more than once that they don't like. And you know, they're the ones that the parents are the ones that the law entrusts to take care of those children. And you know, it's a delicate situation, but if you care about your grandchild, then I think as long as the parent's request is somewhat reasonable, you should do what they want. They're the parents of the child.
You and I have talked, and a lot of people come out of, we've heard a lot about the dysfunctional family. Or perhaps someone is an alcoholic and they've been in a rehabilitation program. They may have been sober for 20 years. When you begin to talk about visitation, can this all come up again on you?
Of course, of course. I mean, that's one of the unfortunate things about grandparent visitation litigation is that often what's really going on is that the parents and the grandparents have not resolved issues that go back to the parent's childhood. There's still a struggle for independence on the part of the child, and they just haven't worked out some of the adolescent rebellion and some of the difficulties that go along with growing up. And what happens is that the child becomes the focus of this conflict that is long-standing. And silly things or minor things can escalate the problem, and all of a sudden you have World War III in your hands over a grandchild, and that's really not what the agenda is. And sometimes what you see is that if things go into litigation, you see parents saying that grandparents shouldn't visit because they abused the parent as a child, or that they've abused the grandchild. That's unfortunately all too common.
Now that's a big issue. I mean, in the last few years I've heard from many people around the United States that someone will say, well, my husband said that she really abused them, and I don't want my children abused like that. In talking to Dr. Arthur Kornhaber, who I've introduced you to, who has a grandparenting foundation and is a child psychiatrist, he has stated that grandparents, the way they raise their kids, most often has nothing to do with the way they would treat their grandchildren. And so, but this is being thrown into court. And
well, the problem is that the grandparents are perfectly adequate caretakers of the child until there's some other disturbance in the family. That these allegations of abuse don't get raised you know, when everyone is getting along, it's perfectly okay for the child to see grandma, but then suddenly when grandma and mom have a fight, then grandma's unfit and shouldn't see the baby anymore. And that's kind of how you know that there's really a different agenda
One
being
of the
played out.
things that I ran across with a grandparent that called me and wanted to know what they could do. Their daughter and son-in-law had been living in their house, and the mother and father decided to move, and they had to sell the house, and they couldn't buy the house, and there was a big family thing over this, and they said, well, if you make us move out of here, you'll never see your grandchildren again. This is, again, a heartbreaking thing, but I find that many of the grandparents that have called me over the last 2 years, that money enters into this. This is kind of sad. But again, that's all this, if you get into court, we're going to talk big bucks here, aren't we, Pat? I mean,
Yes.
some of this litigation, I read an article in Parent magazine that there's a family here in Massachusetts who I've talked to and got to know, spent close to $28,000. That's a lot of money.
One side or both sides
One
together?
side, well, $15,000 on just the grandparent side. They had to get a second mortgage on their home. I think that attorneys, and I'm going to say this again, you need to be aware that this is going to be a very expensive thing. Now, for instance, an attorney now charges anywhere from $150 to $250 an hour. So, as a grandparent, I want to give some practical advice now. Asking an attorney. When I go in, most attorneys say, well, that first consultation is free. Is that correct?
Well, people do it differently. I do. I
You
give
do.
Initial consultations
The first
for free.
but
That's
not
right.
all of them do. What are the questions they need to ask an attorney when a grandparent goes in and they have decided to pursue the right to petition the court? What are the questions they need to ask an attorney, and what do they need to look at?
They need to make sure that they understand the litigation process. One thing that people don't tend to understand is that once you file in court, you subject yourself to a whole lot of rules and procedures that you may not have understood that you were getting yourself into. For example, it's customary to go to family service to mediate visitation disputes. What does that mean? It means that you're going to sit down with someone employed by the court to try to work out your problems.
But now, is this the things you're going to tell them when you're talking to them? Again, I said, what do
Yes.
they need to ask you? The fee, you get a
Okay.
retainer, and then that goes. By the way, they just asked me to remind you that this is a live show, and we would like your calls. If there are grandparents out there or young people, we have a question that we had before we came on, and the telephone number is 657-4066. And this is a live call-in show, and it's an opportunity to ask your questions if you're facing any type of situation where you feel perhaps your grandchildren aren't being taken care of properly, or that there's something that you would like to correct. This is a good time to call in, and grandparents are a vital connection. That's a very important thing to remember. Alex Haley, the author of Roots, said that if we don't know who we are and where we've come from, with warts and all, we become a nation of begats. And I don't, that sounds like pretty bad stuff. I don't want to just begat. I want to know who I am and the background. And this is important for children today. And with the family breaking down so, this seems to be an issue that they don't have. They call them extended families, where the grandparent is there. Would you see that a lot?
Yeah, I'd like to get back to how to deal with your attorney. I think it's pretty critical to know what the steps in the process are. Why? Because your attorney's probably going to charge you on an hourly basis, and you need to know what's involved. So how many hours that's going to be. This is not most grandparent visitation disputes are not resolved in 5 hours, and at $200 an hour that would be $1,000. They're not that way. There's a lot of fact-finding to do. The lawyer needs to be really well prepared. And by getting an overview of how the process works, you'll understand that this is a big commitment on your part and that you need to be prepared to follow through with your commitment.
And I want to say right up front to any grandparents that are out there, one of the first things that an attorney will say if you say, well, I really don't have that money, and I know I've heard this and experienced myself, can you get a mortgage on your home? Now, we're going to be taking a break soon, and I want you to think about some of those things, but we do have a call here, and I think that we answered that before. What is the organization GAP? That is Grandparents as Parents. Now, the AARP has asked Pat and I to come and speak to them on September 15th. And we will be talking at the Winchester Health Center. Well, it's a family health center, but it's here in Wilmington. I still think of it as the Wilmington Community Health Center. It's on Route 62. And you can call Doris Nash at 658-2938. Or you can call Marcia, 658-2917. And do come down, and you'll have an opportunity. There'll be other people there. We will have a child psychologist there to talk to you of the ramifications. Pat, when we come back too, we're going to be talking about guardian ad litems, and that's something that most of you need to learn about. When I was going, I guess you have to get some caught personal. When I was going through my litigation, and I was awarded, it took me a long time, visitation, then a guardian ad litem by not handling something properly upset the apple cart, and it can be a very expensive thing. And when we come back, I want to talk more about guardian ad litems. And I hope that we do have a friend of ours that is going to be coming in. The guardian ad litem, can you explain that the court appoints and basically what that means, ad litem?
Guardian ad litem is guardian for the purpose of litigation. And guardian ad litems are used in many ways, but in custody disputes, they're basically an investigator for the court who may make recommendations about visitation or custody if it's a divorce, that type of thing.
There's an organization I would like to make any grandparent aware of, and it's called the Law and Psychiatric Service of the Massachusetts General Hospital at Harvard Medical School. They have outlined such things, and they are forming an organization, which is very important that they're doing. And Pat can tell you that the Chief Justice of Massachusetts has been wanting this for a long time, for them to have some kind of unified way that they handle this. And they are getting around to doing that. Your friend's name is Vicki Lyle, Dr. Lyle?
She's a professional that I've dealt with in the past. That's right.
You dealt with her on a professional level and,
yes,
and have found a great deal of respect for her. One of the things is the visitation policy. And how is it set up so that some people do it one way and some do it another. That's very important that they begin to standardize. Of course, they have to be able to bend with it too, but so that you know what to expect. If you haven't seen your grandchildren rather, for 6 or 7 months, chances are that the court's going to appoint a guardian ad litem, and you're going to have to go for reunification visits. It's not an easy task, and that's what I want to tell you people. Before you get into this, try mediation, step back, and that's the hardest thing to tell a grandmother when she is heartbroken, is to say step back a little. So I did want to bring that up, but we do have some time now to continue on. You talked about the cost, and now we're going to talk about the statutory limits. If that's
on guardians ad litem?
On guardian ad litem, briefly.
If a court may appoint a guardian ad litem without either of the parties requesting it, just on the court's own motion. And if the court does that, then the state will pay for a very limited amount of service from a guardian ad litem. I believe the current limits are 10 hours of work at the rate of $50 an hour. And since most of the guardian ad litems in visitation cases would be mental health professionals, mental health professionals generally charge between $50 and $150 an hour, so that so that they're not making their usual hourly rate. Also, 10 hours is not very much time because you have to interview both parties. You have to interview the child. You may want to check with the child's therapist, the party's therapist. There's a whole lot of work to be done, and 10 hours is not very much at all in any kind of a complex case.
And that cost can run up very, very quick. I don't want to discourage anyone out there that may be listening about pursuing this, but I do want to say to you that look for mediation. There's a newsletter and a packet that I send out to people because I got so many calls that I had to make something up. And one of them that I say to people, the goals of all of us who want to have a relationship with our grandchildren is to encourage grandparents and other members of the child's extended family who have been denied the right to associate with their grandchild to organize independent self-help groups in their state, county, or town so that you can meet to discuss your mutual concerns and exchange information and work together to obtain state and national laws that will allow any grandparent and/or any member of a child's extended family should have the right to petition the court to request reasonable visitation with a child, regardless of the marital status of the person having custody of the child. That's an issue, Pat, that united families, and there are some states, if you're now, the most recent case that I come to mind is the Twigg and Kimberly case, where the attorney, and I was appalled when I saw this girl on the Today Show, and the Twiggs attorney had said, oh, they'll see her again when she has grandchildren. And my heart just went out to both Kimberly, and I'm saying, how could this person have done this? Now, what's the legal ramifications of what that attorney said?
Well, I started to talk about this at the beginning about who has standing to sue for grandparent visitation, because in most states, if the mother and father are living together, then grandparents have no right at all to bring the parents to court to see the grandchildren. An intact family, when there's an intact family, the grandparents have no rights at all. So what that means is, to the extent that your child has a happy marriage or at least continues to live with his or her own spouse, you're out in the cold. You don't have standing.
Okay, but you talk intact family, and I've had grandparents to call me, and I'm thinking of one that I was in Utah or something like that, and they knew that there was alcoholism, there's abuse going on in that family, and they can't visit their grandkids to see if they're all right. My suggestion to that grandparent was to go to social services and to file a 51A. What would you say in a case like that, where they really are sincerely concerned about their grandchildren?
I think that involving the Department of Social Services in any matter is a very, very aggressive thing to do, and that you should certainly have a very good reason to do that, because Department of Social Services is very intrusive, and your actions can have very unwanted...
Excuse me, Pat, we're going to go to break. That's what that sign was up there, and so please watch the special report that WCTV is presenting to you on wildlife rabies in Massachusetts.
This is a special report on wildlife rabies in Massachusetts.
Hello, this is Sam Sharman, General Manager of Wilmington Community TV. We're presenting this special report on rabies in cooperation with the Massachusetts Department of Health and Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. Over 305 raccoons have tested positive statewide, and you may be aware Wilmington has a large wildlife population. In an effort to provide our viewers with accurate information, we ask that you watch the following report.
Rabies is a virus that affects the nervous system of mammals. Rabies is spread through a bite or a scratch from an infected animal. If left untreated, it is always fatal. Rabies has occurred in Massachusetts periodically since the early 1800s. It has, from time to time, shown up in dogs, cats, foxes, and bats. Rabies currently occurs occasionally in bats. Approximately 3 to 10% of bats annually submitted test positive for rabies. Since 1977, raccoon rabies has been spreading through the mid-Atlantic and Northeast states. Rabies can also be carried by foxes, skunks, cats, dogs, and domestic livestock. You can protect yourself and your family by observing some precautions and by following a few simple rules. Pet owners should be aware that pets are the most likely bridge between wildlife rabies and people. So vaccinate cats and dogs for rabies. Dogs and cats may come in contact with raccoons and may be bitten or scratched. Keep pets restrained at all times. Feed pets indoors and do not leave pet food outside. Campers, hikers, picnickers, do not feed wild animals. Do not approach or handle wild animals. Secure your food and garbage so that wild animals will not have access to them. Homeowners, do not approach or handle wild animals. Do not feed wild animals. Secure garbage and trash in trash containers with tight-fitting lids. Place your trash out for pickup on the same day it will be picked up by rubbish collectors. Cap chimneys with screens, and seal openings in attics, basements, porches, and sheds or barns. If you have contact with an animal suspected of being rabid, take the following steps. Wash the wound thoroughly with soap and water. Seek medical attention immediately. Contact the police department at 658-5071 and the animal control officer in your community. Most importantly, contact your local health department.
We're back on again, and I want to say thank you to Matt. Turn around there, Matt. We're on live, and Matt Garrett tonight is our floor director, and Matt was out, and he came in after I was already on, but that's okay, Matt. You're going to be keeping me all the time and everything. We wanted to get back to the subject that we were talking about, but while we were on that break, I watched that promotion on the rabies thing, but I see that we have the Grandparent Visitation Dispute book on. This is such a heartbreaking thing, and I want to bring up that book, Pat, again, because of the fact that you wrote an excellent article in there, and I don't want to forget about DSS. I do want to get back to what we were saying and try not to, you've got such an ordered mind, and I don't, and that's why I'm sitting here talking about a variety of things and trying to cover as many bases as I can. The time goes by awful quick, as you can see. But could you tell me briefly the article that you wrote for the American Bar Association? And this manual that we have here is one of the first that the American Bar has put out. I do want to tell any grandparents out there that you can order it from the American Bar Association. They plan on putting out more of these type manuals, I understand, so you can, a layperson can understand what they're going to be facing. Now, could you tell me about your article in the book and what you wrote about?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I was contacted by the ABA and asked to write an article about how to represent children in grandparent parent disputes. And lawyers, as we started to say before, get involved with children usually because a court appoints them. And they would become involved either as an attorney for the child or a guardian ad litem. Those are very different roles. A guardian ad litem generally makes recommendations to the court about what he or she feels is in the child's best interest. An attorney for the child, if the child is old enough to have a preference and can talk about his preference, about what he or she wants to do, in that case the attorney would advocate what the child wants. Just like an attorney would treat any other client. You know, if you were my client, it's my job to represent what you want to do. An attorney for the child does much the same thing.
Okay, you wrote some things in here, Pat, I remember reading that were very, very loving, and that you talked about children when I say what exactly were you saying. I'm looking at a preface here that it says, a growing number of grandparents throughout the country have been denied access to their grandchildren by the children's parents or other custodians and have sought legal assistance in obtaining visitation. At least 100 appellate court decisions involving grandparent visitation rights have been published to date. Yet grandparent visitation laws remain relatively new in domestic relations law, and there's little literature on the handling of grandparent visitation cases by judges and domestic relation attorneys, mediators, or other professionals. Now, that was written by Elaine Siegel and Naomi Karp. I believe they're members of the Massachusetts Bar Association also.
No, I think they're members of, they're staff workers at the ABA.
Okay. And in your article, it says, it opens up with grandparent parent disputes over access to children can be an expensive, heartbreaking, and nasty as the worst custody battle I have ever dealt with in the domestic relations court. Could you comment on that?
They are nasty, and they're very expensive. You know, when you think of what the point is that grandparents want to see their grandchildren. As I said before, often what happens is that the grandparent battle that started in adolescence gets played out in a different role, and the child becomes the focus. Neither side has been able to resolve those conflicts, and they just take a different turn and become centered on a different kind of focus, and they're expensive. You know, lawyers in the Boston area charge roughly an average of $200 an hour, and you can imagine how many hours are spent. I mean, just going to court.
Well, you've just talked that 10 hours is not
Nothing.
enough.
It's
And so
nothing.
we're into $2,000 there.
That's right.
People need to understand that. When you talk about, watching a lot and having testified through the Judiciary Committee for the fathers for equal custody, and that's coming up again. I found, Pat, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the paternal grandparents are the majority on the losing end, because once there's a divorce, the girl says, I don't have anything to do with you or your family. Is that what you're finding in the cases that you're representing?
No, the grandparents that I've represented have mostly been mothers, parents, struggling against mother to see the grandchildren.
Against their own daughter?
That's right.
Ah.
You know, courts, that's what courts are for. In divorce situation, a court determines visitation for the father or custody between the parents. It's not always the case that fathers just get visitation. In fact, that's become a very loaded political term. We now talk in terms of parenting plans, when the children will be with each parent. So it's not such a loaded...
I want to give excuse me, Pat, and you said I interrupted you,
That's
but
okay.
I have to again. When Matt comes out here, please call us at 657-4066 if you have any questions at all, and be sure to attend the AARP meeting on September 15th, where this will be a discussion for that evening on grandparents in divided families, grandparents, the vital connecting, and we'll talk about the value of grandparents too at that meeting. And we hope at a later time to have Dr. Kornhaber come on. Some of you grandparents who have turned into snowbirds, it's time for you to have your time together. But grandchildren need you. Stay in touch with them. Many of them just feel like, well, Grandpa and Grandpa's gone off to Florida, and all of a sudden they're not around. And I feel that grandparents are very important, and particularly if one wants to be a grandparent. I'm thinking, Pat, at that little bit that I wrote, and then I want to get back to your article. I have a gold tooth. And one day I was sitting with my granddaughter, and the light just came right in on a tooth. And it caught her eye, and she said, Grandma, you got sun in your mouth. And I said, hey, that's pretty neat. And then she looked at it, and she said, is that real gold? And I said, yeah, it is. Can I have it when you die? And it was just as natural as anything, you know. Can I have the gold? But grandchildren, like I read, looking at your warts, and they don't seem to mind if you're fat, and, you know, there's a lot of love that comes into something like that. And you wrote this article representing children again, and one of the other things you say, the cases are particularly problematic. The grandparent may lack standing to petition.
Right, that's what we talked about. Which types
Okay.
of grandparents have the right to seek visitation in the courts?
Which type? Or you said, well, if there's an intact family.
Right, intact family. Where there's an intact family, there's no right to sue generally. At least, certainly in Massachusetts.
And another thing that I underlined in your article, perhaps the attorneys can't get along or need help persuading their clients to do the right thing. Perhaps one side has a much better case and seeks to ally to focus the judge's attention on those merits. Now, when two attorneys start getting at it sometime, that's not healthy either, Pat, and I've seen that happen because I have gone in as an advocate, where that they have to really begin to look at the right thing. You're talking about representing a child. Not that your ethic right now says to defend your client to the death practically. That's your client. But when does it come, and we were talking about that earlier, where you feel in your heart, this just isn't the right thing and I'm representing this child?
Well, I think that attorneys who represent children have a very different kind of perspective on things. There was just a recent ethics opinion about representing children that says that when the child wants to do something that you think, wants you to take a position that in your heart, and after searching your conscience, you feel is really harmful to the child, then you need to try to persuade the child that they're wrong or withdraw. Just like, you know, if I represent a parent who wants to violate a court order or wants to break the law in some way, you know, it's my job to try to convince that parent not to do that. And if the client and I really can't see eye to eye, then it's my job to withdraw from the case and not represent her because I'm not serving his or her best interests. I can't be an advocate if I strongly, strongly, strongly disagree with my client about how to do something.
This attorney that has been recently represented the young man who divorced his biological parents, and now I believe he was involved in the Kimberly case. It seems to be such a new thing. Are there some cautions, Pat? I just am very uncomfortable with some of this, where we talk about children's rights, but that attorneys are coming in here now, and certainly we've moved so much further, but we're talking grandparent, but custody issues too. Is that, I mean, I'm sure it's going to create a lot of litigation for attorneys, but do you feel that it's, I know Hillary Clinton is pushing this, and who's going to pay for this?
Well, most attorneys for children are paid for by the parents. Sometimes they're court appointed and they work for very inexpensively at the state rate, but you know, it's up to the judge to decide whether attorneys for children are appointed. No one goes out and, you know, hangs up a shingle at the local elementary school saying, you know, if you have problems with your parents, come see me. That's not how attorneys for children get their clients. They're court appointed. So obviously the court thinks that there's a reason, that there's a problem, and that the child's perspective has to be appointed. A court makes a definite choice when it appoints either an attorney for the child to do what the child thinks should be done, or a guardian ad litem who makes recommendations about what's in the child's best interest. The two are not the same.
They're not the same. And you brought up a very good point. I don't think that attorneys right now are saying openly, but I believe that every time a child sees on television that these cases that are coming up, where the children are suing their parents and this is happening and so forth and so on, I think the kids are getting the message in some way and saying, and in the belligerent years anyway, it's difficult.
Sure, it's difficult, but you know, both of those cases were very extreme cases. Very extreme. That's not what, you know, parents and children have difficulties and there's rebellion and there are problems, but you know,
those were extremes.
Those were extreme cases. And I don't think that they set a precedent that we have to worry that our own children are going to, you know, file a lawsuit to terminate our parental rights. That's not going to happen very often.
Well, you said it right here in your article. Children usually become represented by counsel or by a guardian ad litem when the conflict between the parties seems especially intense. And it gets intense and it's getting to a bitter battle.
That's right.
And then then the court will appoint someone.
That's right.
And again, we're getting back into the issue of the child's best interest. Now, has there been any statutes on or outlining what a child's best interest is? We put grandparents and parents against people saying it's in their best interest. One of the things I would like to say, and take this opportunity if you're considering this at all, and I know that Pat would agree with me, sit down and write a diary of what your relationship has been with your grandchild. It's very important. If you have the photographs that show the things that you've done with this child, that is going to be very important to a judge. And the other thing that is very important to remember, that you're going into a court of law. That's how I see it, not a court of justice. And for years, I felt I was going in for justice, and I find that law comes first. And so, you know, it's good to have an attorney if you can afford one. If you can't, you can go in and represent yourself pro se. Very difficult to do, but if your heart is there in the right thing, I think the judges see that, and they're very helpful. They tell me that we've got about 10 or 15 more minutes. I want to remind you to call 657. There was a call from a young person that said, if my parents get divorced, can I see my grandparents? What would be the answer to that young man?
Yes, that you should have the same access to your grandparents after the divorce as you did before the divorce. I mean, your grandparents didn't cause the divorce, and you should feel free to call them and write them and see them just as though the divorce had not occurred.
The situation of telephone calls and things, of how people can call, or maybe a grandparent, do they need to have a right to call that child, or can they do that to call and say hello to the child? It can be refused to them.
Sure it can,
but
yeah, I think that if your child divorces, that you have to make every effort to keep your relationship with your ex-daughter-in-law or ex-son-in-law as calm and as civil as it was before the divorce. You know, when two people can't get along, they get a divorce. That doesn't mean that the extended families have to start the Hatfield and the McCoy type of battle. That does no one any good. And certainly your relationship with a child and your relationship with your former son-in-law and daughter-in-law should stand or fall on its own merits. It shouldn't be so entangled with your own child and the fact that they got a divorce.
I agree with you on that. And I didn't know, Pat, whether you knew, but there's a Representative Dowd has had hearings. This has gotten to a national level now, and they had recently in October of 1991, there were hearings in the Subcommittee on Human Services, Grandparents' Right, Preserving Generational Bonds. The government feels that intact families and trying to keep families together, grandparents, and we firmly believe, I'm reading from a statement from Ethel J. Nunn, Executive Director of the Grandparents United for Children's Rights, and I like that. We're really talking about children's rights in Madison, Wisconsin. We firmly believe that the child welfare system is in crisis, and we will work toward major change in the human and social service system, the legal system, and the other child care institutions. We have another call, and I want to thank you. Said we've got one coming in right now. Let's see what this is. Can the mother keep my presence away from my grandchild? That's a good question. And if you send something, how do you know your grandchildren are going to get them?
Well, you don't. But hopefully, parents are still teaching their children to write thank you notes when they receive gifts from the grandparents. So hopefully you'll get a thank you note, and that acknowledging that your gift has been received. I mean, there's no way, I mean, unless you get a court order requiring that the mother let the child open the presents, there's no way that you're ever going to really know. Again, I think the important thing is to just try to keep the lines of communication open, and perhaps give a call and say, oh, you know, how did she like the doll, or did the clothing fit? And don't do that with animosity, just kind of out of a sense of curiosity, and follow up and see if you can, again, reestablish the connection.
The second part of that question was, and I think that Pat has answered that, what can I do if the mother is keeping my presents and not giving them to the child, and maybe they don't even know that I exist any further? You've answered that, and that's the time that you go into the court.
Well,
if you can.
That's the time when you try to sit down with the mother of the children and talk about what's happened, that you're being shut out. And if you can, you know, keep that on a calm, rational level, you might actually be able to improve your relationship, and certainly improving your relationship is going to do a whole lot more to ensure that you see your grandchildren than going to court is. Going to court is really a last resort when every other mechanism has failed, because it's very expensive, and you put your future in the hands of a judge who is never going to know the situation as well as you and your daughter, or your daughter-in-law, or your son and your son-in-law.
That's exactly the way that any of you ought to think that are considering this or having difficulties. There is a newsletter that Dr. Kornhaber puts out. It's called Vital Connection. And you'll notice that though it is a letter for grandparents, that it says one of the big articles in it is children's rights. Is the time right for a constitutional amendment? And we're talking about children that are subject to abuse. Some of the things that some of you might not be aware of is that I would think only maybe 5 years ago, the social services, and we didn't get into that, didn't consider grandparents. They'd go out and place the children someplace else. Because of activists and grandparents that say, I would like to take care of, they're now looking to the grandparents. So the child is staying within that home and making safe homes. There's legislative update that all of you should be aware of, and looking to there's camps. There's a wonderful summer camp. There was one held up in Maine. I go to a place called Ferry Beach. It's a Unitarian campground. They started through some suggestions that I made. They now have a grandparent camp up there, and they were completely sold out this year. 25 grandparents came with their grandchildren. They had time to be with them on the beach and to have some little inner workshop type things, and to really old-fashioned get with your grandkids and sit down and play in the mud and do those types of things. Dr. Kornhaber has a camp every year. He has a place up in the Adirondacks, I believe, and he has over 200 grandparents who come up and bring their grandchildren, and it's like a big camp out and everything. Pat, I want to thank you for coming on. I know that we're getting near the end. Is there anything particularly I did want to, again, because I'm very proud of this. I've read this. Pat wrote Grandparent Access, a Model Statute for the Yale Law and Policy Review. You're a graduate of Yale?
Law school.
Law school. And I underlined in here one of the things that you said is it's a biological fact that grandparents are bound to their grandchildren by the unbreakable links of heredity. It is a common human experience that the concern and interest of grandparents take in the welfare of their grandchildren far exceeds anything explicitly in purely biological terms. A very special relationship often arises and continues between grandparents and grandchildren. And it does. It's a different bond. It's a time for a grandparent that might not have been the best parent to just love unconditionally. As a parent and a grandparent, I know that I had certain expectations for my children. I have things I'd like to see my grandchildren do, but I can just love them unconditionally. They can come and spill something on the floor, and you handle that a little differently. They can wear you out very quick. But this book was this review that you wrote, Pat, was very sensitive and loving, and I know you as that type of a person. And I want to thank you for coming with us today. Do you have anything that you would like to say to grandparents that are going through this difficult time right now, and how they might proceed?
I think if they have, they should try to find a common link with their children or their in-laws, to use any mechanism that they can to open up communication, whether it's a minister or a counselor or a rabbi or some family friend that they have in common, because courts can't right every wrong. You can't make people by court order be pleasant. You can't legislate relationships, and it's really up to the people that are involved in the dispute to settle it. So I would recommend that you do everything in your power, including admitting when you've made a mistake, to try to keep yourselves out of court and try to keep your families together psychologically, even if they're not together physically.
Well, I think that you said it very well then, and you also said it in this beautiful work that you wrote. A substantial relationship between a grandparent and a grandchild is one that is continuous, affectionate, intimate, and stimulating to the child. In determining whether a substantial relationship is formed, the following factors must be considered. The amount of time spent with the grandparent. That's very important. The frequency in contact with the grandparent. The regularity. So if you are a grandparent, love those children and bring them to your home and let them come and let them have fun. Don't argue with with the parents. Sort of set up something. My recommendation in closing would be to find out what they want and what they want the child to eat and what they don't want them to do, and try to stay within that. Don't try to break those rules, and listen to what the parents want. And that's the thing that I would say to anyone. And I want to thank you again for coming to talk about. Tonight we were a little bit. We were a lot serious, and I'm so thankful that Pat could come. And again, thank you, Pat.
Thank you.
And thank you, and hope that you'll come back, and maybe we can discuss some other issues. And look forward again to seeing you at the AARP meeting.
Thank
you for coming, and thank you for watching Talk About.